Okay, this is just a short video of job order costing, journal entries, and the flow of those costs. And so we are looking at materials, labor, and all their costs are in overhead. And so those costs flow into our goods and process inventory for each job as we work on those jobs. And so our first journal entry we're going to look at is our direct materials. And so in order to transfer direct materials to goods in process, we would do a journal entry of debit to our goods in process inventory. We want to debit where it's going, and then we want to credit our raw materials inventory. As we're gathering materials for the job, we have direct materials and we also have indirect materials. Those indirect materials, they go to the factory overhead account. And so we would debit factory overhead and we would credit raw materials. And so that would be B, our indirect materials go into our factory overhead. Next, we would look at our direct labor. So C, when we transferred our direct labor to our goods in process, we would debit our goods in process inventory and then we would credit factory payroll. And we also have people working in the factory that we consider indirect labor. And so what we would do is that cost of that labor, we would transfer that to our factory overhead by debiting factory overhead and crediting our factory payroll. And so that is our D. So our indirect labor would go into our factory overhead. Next, we have these costs that are in our overhead, and using a predetermined rate, we want to put them into goods in process. So for each job, we want to transfer a portion of that overhead to our goods in process based off of some predetermined rate and how we're going to allocate it to that job. It could be by labor hours, it could be by machine hours, or whatever the case may be. But what we would do is we would debit our goods in process inventory, and then we would credit our factory overhead. So if we scroll down here at the bottom and look at what we have, here's our factory overhead. And keep in mind, of course, indirect material goes into factory overhead, our indirect labor, and then we have all other overhead costs. They will also go into that factory overhead. And then we would apply, if I can get it to mark, then we would apply our overhead. So we want to apply our overhead. And that was our E. So now in our goods in process inventory for the job, we got some direct materials, we got some direct labor, and we have overhead. And so once we complete the job, we want to transfer it to our finished goods inventory. So the completed job would be transferred to our finished goods inventory. And so that entry would be a debit to finished goods inventory. And then we would credit goods in process inventory. And then finally, we would sell the good. So when we sell the good, we would debit cost of goods sold when we sell the good. I'm having problems. This pen is getting stuck. So when we sell it, we would debit cost of goods sold. Okay, I did the entry. But so we would debit cost of goods sold, and then we would credit finished goods inventory. And so that is the entry that we would do when we finally sold the good. So if we look back down here at the bottom, that's that last entry, and that's when it's sold. So hopefully that gives you a visual, and then also the journal entries. But the important thing to remember about the journal entries, when you go back and you look at all my journal entries, you'll determine that anytime I was putting something into an account, meaning where it was going, if I was putting materials into goods in process, I would debit it. If I was putting labor into goods in process, I would debit it. So you debit where it's going, and then you credit where it's coming from. So if I would debit goods in process, because that's where my direct material was going, I would credit raw materials inventory because that's where it was coming from. So hopefully this helps. Sorry about the little interruptions.